with the new government was the rollback on a commitment to make sure that GLCs and GLICs were run professionally. We had, the expunging of many of the nominees that came under the Pakatan Harapan government, and many political nominees took over those positions. And because analysts have noted for a long time that GLCs are a major source of corruption, in the country, in the sense that they are used by political figures to advance their interests. What do you make of this particular reversal?
Yes. Well, even during the Pakatan Harapan government, some agencies were also political appointees. But of course, you're right. When the current government came, it was massive. The number of appointed political appointees in the GLCs many of them were appointed. So this is also another factor that actually influences. And the other main issue is some of them seem to be not qualified. They don't have the experience to lead GLCs.
Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. In the recently released Corruption Perceptions Index 2020 by Transparency International, Malaysia's ranking in the index fell to 57th position out of 180 countries. Now, this compared to 51st place in 2019. So over the next 30 minutes on the show, we're going to be looking at what accounts for this drop and how this reversal in the fight against corruption can be arrested. Joining us first on the show, we have Dr Muhammad Mohan. He's the president of Transparency International Malaysia. Mohan, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. So the latest CPI report cited that the COVID-19 pandemic is not just a health and economic crisis, but also a corruption crisis too. Maybe you can begin our conversation by elaborating a little bit on that.
Released
Mohan, are you there?
Every year, and the reason for the drop in the score as well as the ranking is because the reform agenda that was started after the G14 has actually sort of stalled. In particularly the institutional reforms that was being carried out in the year of 2018 and 2019, it was stalled. And one example I can give you is for example, the political financing bill that was supposed to be tabled in March 2020, and that did not happen. And subsequently, other reforms that was all been planned did not materialize. Of course, we understand that when the Perikatan national government came into power, the focus was on the COVID-19 pandemic, and that was the focus of the government. But that doesn't mean that reforms cannot take place. So this is one of the reasons. On top of that, there were many other issues, especially the asset declaration. There was supposed to be a law to be drafted and tabled. That also has not happened. And so a lot of reforms had not happened. And also we had a series of corruption-related cases, and those were the issues that actually had a big role to play. So these all had played into the whole issue and so on. But on the positive side, when the PN government came into power, they did not say that they're going to dismantle some of the plans put by the previous government, the Pakatan Harapan government. For example, the National Anti-Corruption Plan. They endorsed the plan and they agreed that they will continue with the initiatives inside the plan. So that is something positive. Besides that,
Mohan, if I could interrupt, Mohan, I do want to ask you though, since you brought up the question of institutional reform, one of the major things that we saw with the new government was the rollback on a commitment to make sure that GLCs and GLICs were run professionally. We had, the expunging of many of the nominees that came under the Pakatan Harapan government, and many political nominees took over those positions. And of course, analysts have noted for a long time that GLCs are a major source of corruption, in the country, in the sense that they are used by political figures to advance their interests. What do you make of this particular reversal?
Yes. Well, even during the Pakatan Harapan government, some agencies were also political appointees. But of course, you're right. When the current government came, it was massive. The number of appointed political appointees in the GLCs many of them were appointed. So this is also another factor that actually influences. And the other main issue is some of them seem to be not qualified. They don't have the experience to lead GLCs or GLICs, and it's best to be left to technocrats to handle this. So you're right in that sense that what the government had done was to appoint a lot of these political appointees, which is something that we have taken a stand, and then we say that politicians should not be heading the GLCs or GLICs. Instead, they should get into the parliamentary select committees to actually be a check and balance for the performance of these GLCs and GLICs.
Right. Mohan, it's been a couple of days now since Transparency International released the Corruption Perceptions Index. And I'm wondering whether, there's been responses, a mixed bag of responses. There have been people who have been outraged, and there have been other people who have been trying to justify or rationalize this decline in the rankings, this slide in the rankings. I'm wondering, maybe you can help put it into context for us. Give us an analysis of Malaysia's CPI scores from the past few years. Where are we now? I mean, I understand that last year we were perhaps at the highest ranking that we've been, or we scored the highest points that we've been. How bad is this slide in the context of the past, say, 10 years?
Okay, the early years, our assessment is actually, we will actually take it from 2012. The reason for that is anything before that, the methodology had actually changed for the CPI. So we'll take it from 2012. And the score actually from as low as 47, it actually went up to as high as 52. And then after the 1 MDB issue surfaced in 2014, it was all the way down and back to the 47 and 48 score. And after G14, 28 sort of in 2019 we saw a big jump in the score to move our rank to 51. So the reason for that jump was because when the change of government happened, they came with a very strong manifesto, and the agenda was to reform and fight corruption. And that's how that National Anti-Corruption Plan was actually established. So those were the factors actually pushed up our score dramatically. However, when the PN government came into power, now we see that we have lost 2 points or 2 marks, and our rank has dropped by 6. Now, of course, the
Mohan,
2 points
sorry, can I interject? I do want to ask you, though, some of the major red flags that we've had, especially in terms of the commitment to, to bring or make accountable people who are committing corrupt practices. I'm thinking about the discharging of some high-profile cases. Musa Aman, that particular case, and how it led to the attempted, regime change in Sabah, and so on and so forth. What do you make of that particular event, and the role of the Attorney General's chambers in dealing with corruption?
Well, back to those cases, like in the case of the former chief minister had 40 over charges, that was given a DNA, and then we had Riza Aziz also was given a DNA, and another one person, So those kind of things actually do influence. But let me just be clear. The Corruption Perception Index is not only about measuring corruption. It is also looking into human rights. It also looks into reforms. It also looks into justice. And the worrying today situation for us is today, it also looks at parliamentary democracy. So with our situation today, we have with the emergency and with the parliamentary democracy being suspended, we are very concerned because these surveys are done, secondary surveys from secondary sources, and some of these sources are actually looking into democracy. So our concern is for 2021, how will the score be? If we are going to continue not to have a check and balance, then that is going to negatively influence the score.
Right, definitely. Good point to bring up. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight, Mohan. We really do appreciate your time. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This. We'll be back with more on this topic, so don't go anywhere. Stay tuned.
Masih belum berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.astroawani.com atau aplikasi Astro Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps to stop the spread of COVID-19, social distancing, face mask. Follow these steps, this SOP, with the utmost discipline. Together, we can flatten the curve.
Perang COVID-19 tetap belum berakhir. Pastikan setiap langkah berjaga-jaga diamalkan, dari kebersihan tangan, pemakaian pelitup muka, penjarakan fizikal. Kesemuanya amat penting untuk pastikan pandemik ini dibendung.
Fokus kita sekarang adalah gelombang ketiga. Elakkan 3S, iaitu kawasan yang sesak, sempit dan juga bersembang pada jarak yang dekat. Berdisiplinlah kerana virus ini tidak mengira darjat, umur mahupun latar belakang anda. Tiada masa untuk kita berlengah lagi.
Kita sekarang telah memasuki gelombang ketiga COVID-19. Setiap langkah pencegahan perlu diamalkan dengan penuh tanggungjawab dan disiplin. Kita mampu meratakan lengkung pandemik ini. Semuanya di tangan kita bersama.
Perang COVID-19 masih belum berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.astroawani.com atau aplikasi Astro Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps to stop the spread of COVID-19. Social distancing, face mask, follow these steps, this SOP with the utmost discipline. Together, we can flatten the curve.
Perang COVID-19 tetap belum berakhir. Pastikan setiap langkah berjaga-jaga diamalkan, dari kebersihan tangan, pemakaian pelitup muka, penjarakan fizikal. Kesemuanya amat penting untuk pastikan pandemik ini dibendung.
Fokus kita sekarang adalah gelombang ketiga. Elakkan 3S, iaitu kawasan yang sesak, sempit dan juga bersembang pada jarak yang dekat. Berdisiplinlah kerana virus ini tidak mengira darjat, umur mahupun latar belakang anda. Tiada masa untuk kita berlengah lagi.
Kita sekarang telah memasuki gelombang ketiga COVID-19. Setiap langkah pencegahan perlu diamalkan dengan penuh tanggungjawab dan disiplin. Kita mampu meratakan lengkung pandemik ini. Semuanya di tangan kita bersama.
Perang COVID-19 masih belum berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.astroawani.com atau aplikasi Astro Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to
Thanks so much for staying with us on Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Let's continue our conversation about the Corruption Perceptions Index. Malaysia has dropped 6 places in the most recent rankings. We are now 57th position among 180 countries. Joining us on the line now, we have Cynthia Gabriel. She's the Executive Director of the Advocacy Group Centre to Combat Corruption and Cronyism, or better known as C4. Cynthia, good evening. Thanks so much for joining us on the show. Now, how concerned are you about how much the declaration of emergency makes governance more opaque? I mean, how much can be hidden behind the cloak of emergency rule?
Well, the declaration of emergency is now 3 weeks into existence already. And as we were very concerned right from the beginning, we're really pretty much alarmed that it has actually put democracy and the rule of law at peril. There's essentially almost no check and balance mechanisms. So as we all know, Parliament has been suspended. There is still a Parliament, but it has no exercise of power to actually scrutinize the actions of the government. And we are actually very concerned that there is a black veil now, as you would understand it to be, that we cannot get any kind of information with regard to procurement of COVID vaccines, what is the distribution mechanism, what is the plan of the government, and for how the emergency is actually impacting on the numbers of COVID, etc. So it is actually a very important and very central question, because there is a very serious issue on the subversion of the rule of law.
Cynthia, beside the question of COVID-19 and the management of the public health crisis, what other things can be done during this emergency period that will also escape scrutiny? What exactly do you know of the powers that are now invested in the government and the executive that will allow them to, sign contracts, give people, or particular business interests leeway in terms of projects and such? I mean, what exactly can happen in the 6 months or so that we're told the emergency will last?
Well, we're just very concerned now that because we're under emergency rule, the issue of procurement has always been shaded and kept away from the public eye. But at least then we had institutions like the parliament that could exercise some form of check and balance. Now we don't. And we also have a situation where getting information from government is something which is very central. It is completely cut out. And for now, until the 1st of August, as long as the emergency rule is in place, that is how it's going to be. So there will be no parliament sitting. And we're very concerned that even in an emergency rule, as the federal constitution speaks, there is a role for parliament to actually play that check and balance rule. But in this case, there isn't. And the other institutions like the judiciary, the MACC, etc., it's really left to be seen how much of the powers and functions can actually be exercised during this time. Right. But what I would like to stress is it's actually burdening the rakyat and the people so much more because the suffering is on this end, but we're not able to get real-time information, even on COVID, to be able to understand the pandemic and what do we do as citizens of Malaysia to actually counter it.
Right. Well, Cynthia, just before we got you on the line, we spoke to Mohan from Transparency International Malaysia about the rankings. And one of the recommendations that TI had put forth with this report was to compel public officials who are found guilty of corruption to vacate their official positions, even while they exhaust their appeal process. I'm wondering, from your point of view, feasibly and practically, the practicalities of this, how likely is this in Malaysia?
My honest opinion, very unlikely. It's because there hasn't been a punishment punitive system in the civil service to actually punish those involved and charged for corruption. So it's very difficult. But what I would like to recommend is the enforcement actually gets tightened. And there is a serious issue of law enforcement corruption in Malaysia. And we're not just talking about one law enforcement. We're not just talking about the police because everyone's talking about the IPCMC and the lack of accountability when it comes to police and how deep-rooted police corruption is. But my recommendation would also be for all law enforcement to be seriously overhauled. We know recently there was a big scandal with the immigration department where visas were just being given out and a couple of highly ranked deputy directors were also charged and now being investigated by the MECC for corruption. So it is a very pivotal area for reforms. But what I would also like to say is that public procurement has a big role in which the civil service comes into focus. And this is where the MECC has recorded more than 42.8% of complaints related to public procurement issues. So billions of taxpayers' money actually gets wasted on procurement and contracts and awards of contracts that actually goes to cronies. And nowadays, we see nepotism also playing a very heavy hand in how contracts are being awarded. So this goes back. Yes.
Can I just ask you to address this question? Mohan from Transparency International said that one of the reasons for the fall in the ranking is because of this rollback on the reform agenda. But at the same time, we see the MACC conducting raids and, in fact, arresting fairly high-ranking members of the of institutions like the immigration, so on and so forth. So in terms of the public perception of things changing or getting better, how should we understand these seem to be conflicting dynamics? The end of reform, but at the same time, criminals are being pursued.
Well, when there was the sudden coup and the Sheraton move, as we all know it, there was a big agenda called reform around anti-corruption and promoting good governance, which was hanging in the balance. There was a national anti-corruption plan that was developed by the previous administration. And there was no time for the plan to actually be implemented because their rule were cut short after 22 months. So I'd like to actually put it on the table that we have to ask Prime Minister Muhyiddin and his cabinet members what has happened to the plan. So he has actually said through a PMO statement that the plan remains, but it's very much, just piecemeal reforms that you can't really feel as tangible. In fact, the rollbacks have been quite serious, and the National Anti-Corruption Plan may have just been binned and just put into the trash can altogether. So there's a whole lot of commitment that needs to be seen for the reform agenda to continue and to take shape. Because right now, we're seeing many rollbacks in the. Yeah.
We'll have to find out more about that and get a follow-up on updates on the National Anti-Corruption Plan. Thank you, Cynthia, for joining us on the show. We appreciate your time. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back after these messages with more on the fight against corruption here in Malaysia. Stay tuned.
Masih belum berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.astroawani.com atau aplikasi Astro Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps.
Thank you so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about Malaysia's 6-point drop in Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index 2020. Joining us on the line now, we have Dr. K.M. Loy. He's the president of the Association of Anti-Bribery Management Systems Practitioners Malaysia. He was the vice chair of the committee responsible for the design and development of the anti-bribery management systems standard. So it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Loy, now you've got decades of experience in anti-corruption work. I'd like to begin our conversation with your views on Malaysia's drop in the CPI rankings. Loy, there? Okay, Loy, are you there? You're on the line with us? Can we get your views on the 6th place drop in the CPI rankings?
It looks like we've lost Dr. Loy for a minute. Yeah. So,
yes, it does seem that we've got some technical difficulties in trying to get him back on the line.
What I think would be really interesting in a discussion with him is the fact that the 2020 enforcement of the June 1st, 2020 enforcement of the corporate liability provision in the MACC Act, really places a burden of proof on businesses that they have put into place what is called the 5 principal guidelines on adequate procedures to prevent bribery and threat of potential corruption within their own business. And I wonder if businesses are aware of this, because sometimes these things pass without adequate, public engagement, so that businesses might not be aware that this is in fact now their responsibility, and they can't claim ignorance.
I do think. All right, so I think we have him on the line. Loy, are you back on the line now? I'd like to repeat my question and ask you for your views on why Malaysia dropped so much in the CPI rankings.
Yeah, Loy here. Yes, obviously you realize that our CPI has dropped from last year, which is just a few numbers, but it really means a lot to us. But if you were to analyze Malaysia CPI over the last 10 years or so, you see that we always score a range between 50 and not more than that. Yeah, but I believe there always room for improvement. And are we actually addressing this to improve our CPI or not? That is always a big question. Are we targeting the right and focus on the right effort to fight corruption, to curb corruption, to curtail corruption the right way or not? So I believe there are still more room for us to improve.
Lloyd, could you help us understand the corporate liability provision, Section 17A of the MACC Act that now places the burden of proof on businesses to put in place the 5 principal guidelines on adequate procedures? Could you explain that to us?
Well, if you realize that a corporate liability is not new as far as Malaysia is concerned, because in the year 2013, then the Tan Sri Abdul Qasim, the MACC chief, had mentioned that we are going to introduce this corporate liability since the year 2013. But in the world, as far as the 2017, up to 2017, a lot of countries have already improved, revised their own act, Prevention of Corruption Act or whatsoever, is to address the corporate liability. And this is where, in line with our UNCAC, United Nations Convention Against Corruption, this is one of the activities to bring forward. So what I'm trying to say is that corporate liability is not new, but it has been quite some time. And if you realize...
Lloyd, sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to point out that the Corruption Perceptions Index by Transparency International, that focuses on the public sector. Looking at the corporate liability, that's the private sector. It is, it's a supply and demand. Corruption requires supply and demand, a give and a take. How are businesses adopting this? Are businesses aware about corporate liability, of their role in preventing corruption?
Well, it's a more important thing that even we have to measure CPI based on the public sector. But it's important that we have to improve the ease of doing business. And to ease of doing business is that sometimes there could be a conflict of interest in the government policy. And also, we always say that there's a give and take issue. And this is very important to address this issue. Don't forget, out of these 9 surveys that TI is focusing on, is one very important survey, which is called the IMD World Competitiveness Report. Yeah, and this is where we score very low. It's only 51. But you realize that this is also important, one of the data that needs to be collected. If I remember correctly, many years ago, our Malaysian Productivity Corporation, our government agency, is responsible to be the focus point to coordinate this type of survey. I'm not sure whether MPC is still doing it or not. But it's very important, plays a very important role, because the other index that we refer to, called the World Economic Forum, and this survey scores 62%, whereas the World Competitiveness Survey by the IMD score only 51%. It's a contradictory. It means it's a mismatch. Where does this happen? Where as much as the corporate liability is concerned, but it's the other side. Who is the taker? Who is the giver?
Right.
Yeah.
No, unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I do want to have you back on the show to discuss this further. But thank you so much for joining us on the line tonight. We really do appreciate your insights. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.